Daphne du Maurier's short story The Birds, first published in her 1952 collection The Apple Tree, a short novel and several long stories, is a Gothic horror tale centered on a man who must protect his family from violent, inexplicably organized bird attacks. The story reflects the social isolation felt by many in 1950s England and evokes British civilians' memories of vulnerability during the Blitz, alongside a fear of destructive natural forces. Alfred Hitchcock's 1963 film The Birds is a famous adaptation, though a loose one, which du Maurier did not particularly appreciate. Du Maurier, a 20th-century British author, frequently explored complex themes through the personal experiences of her characters, as seen in her renowned 1938 novel Rebecca, which Hitchcock also adapted. In The Birds, the protagonist is Nat Hocken, a man whose backstory is revealed in fragments. He has a wartime disability, works part-time on a farm, and, though married with children, is a solitary individual who prefers working alone. The third-person omniscient narrator leaves many aspects of Nat's life and environment ambiguous, only revealing them through his memories and reflections. This narrative style creates a sense of unease, setting the stage for the unfolding horror. The story begins with an ominous change in the wind on the night of December 3rd, signaling the abrupt arrival of winter. Nat, a keen birdwatcher, has noticed the birds acting more restless and numerous than usual that autumn. The local farmer, unnamed in the story, attributes this to the impending harsh winter. The cold east wind arrives that night, along with a terrifying series of bird attacks on Nat's home. Over the course of the night, the birds strike the cottage windows 3 times, each attack growing in intensity. During the final assault, a flock invades the children's room, where Nat's children, Jill and Johnny, are attacked. Nat fights off the birds, focusing on protecting his eyes, the birds' primary target. By dawn, the birds retreat, leaving behind a scene of destruction, including the bodies of dozens of small birds. The land has transformed into a desolate winter landscape, and although Nat's family survives, Johnny bears the scars of the attack, narrowly escaping being blinded by the birds. Nat tries to reassure his wife, whose name the narrator never reveals, by insisting that the birds' unusual behavior is simply a result of the weather. He tells the children that the east wind is making the birds act strangely, but inside, he fears another attack is imminent. He instructs his wife to keep all windows and doors closed, then walks Jill to the bus stop before heading to the farm to gather information. At the farm, Nat speaks with Mrs. Trigg, the farmer's wife, and Jim, the cowman. Mrs. Trigg comments on the sudden chill, speculating whether it's coming from Russia or, as a radio announcer suggested, the Arctic Circle. Nat recounts the previous night's terrifying events, but Mrs. Trigg seems skeptical and struggles to fully believe his account. This frustrates Nat, but he understands how it might sound to her. Had it not been for those corpses on the bedroom floor, he would have considered the tale exaggeration too. He inquires about the birds, but Jim shows little interest. These conversations remind Nat of the indifference he encountered after the World War II air raids, when those who hadn't experienced the devastation seemed unable to grasp its severity. Since Mrs. Trigg and Jim did not witness the bird attacks, they find the idea implausible. After leaving the farm, Nat returns home and clears the children's room of the dead birds, placing the bodies in a sack. Unable to dig a grave in the frozen ground, he decides to take the bodies to the beach and throw them into the sea, where hundreds of gulls gather, riding the breakers in a menacing formation. Upon returning to the cottage, Nat learns from the wireless that the government has issued a statement about birds congregating in large numbers across the country. The Home Office discusses this eerie phenomenon, offering an explanation and advising listeners to secure their homes. Feeling validated for taking the situation seriously, Nat boards up the windows and blocks the chimney, recalling his preparations during the Blitz. Additional reports announce that birds are causing chaos and disarray everywhere. Concerned that the government will prioritize urban areas over the countryside, Nat begins to strategize on how to conserve household supplies for the impending crisis, realizing he can only rely on himself. As high tide approaches, the gulls rise, darkening the sky unnaturally. Nat goes to the bus stop to wait for Jill, but while there, he watches in horror as the masses of birds split into groups, flying in the 4 cardinal directions. An instinctual dread washes over him as he suspects the birds are organizing for an attack, though he can't pinpoint who might be directing them. He rushes to a call box to report the birds' behavior, leaving a message with the operator, who seems unfazed by the warning. Jill and several other children arrive on the bus, but before heading home, Nat urges them to return immediately. Although they argue, they eventually comply. As Nat and Jill walk home, which feels too slow to Nat, the gulls circle closer. By chance, they encounter Mr. Trigg in his car. He offers to take Jill home, while Nat continues on foot. After dropping Jill off, Mr. Trigg returns to speak with Nat about the birds. He shares that townspeople suspect the Russians have poisoned Britain's birds to turn them violent, but Nat remains unconvinced. Mr. Trigg believes a few shots from his gun will scare the gulls away, and he mentions that Mrs. Trigg is joking about cooking gulls. They believe that a bit of shooting will send the gulls flying for cover, so they see no reason to board up the windows. Nat urges Mr. Trigg to take precautions, but the farmer playfully calls Nat windy and leaves with a joking promise of gull for breakfast in the morning. As Nat steps into the field next to his house, the gulls spring into action, diving at him, pecking and clawing at his head. With each successive attack, the birds grow bolder, showing no regard for their own safety. Some dive low and miss, crashing to the ground in a bruised and broken heap. In his frantic escape, Nat stumbles, kicking the fallen bodies aside as he focuses on protecting his eyes while rushing toward the cottage door. A gannet aims at him just as he reaches safety, but he makes it inside just in time. The second half of the story chronicles Nat's efforts to reinforce the cottage against the relentless onslaught while also trying to keep his family's spirits up. The reports from the wireless grow increasingly dire until the broadcast cuts out completely. The Hockens hear airplanes overhead, possibly on a reconnaissance mission, followed by the sound of planes crashing, likely due to bird strikes. Nat considers the mission suicidal. He begins to observe the birds' battle strategy and realizes it aligns with the tides. They attack during high tide and rest at ebb tide. During the calmer ebb tide hours, when the gulls ride the waves and their companions wait on shore, Nat can venture outside to further fortify the cottage or gather supplies. After the first night of the gulls' bombardment, Nat visits the farm with his family in tow, as his wife cannot bear to be left alone with the children. He insists they hide while he approaches the property. Suspecting that the Triggs and Jim are dead due to the absence of smoke from the farmhouse chimneys and the sight of the cows roaming the yard with painfully full udders, Nat's fears are confirmed. Jim's body, what's left of it, lies in the yard, and it appears he was in the midst of shooting at the birds when he met his end. Mr. Trigg's body is found by the house telephone, while Mrs. Trigg lies upstairs, her broken umbrella beside her. Nat cannot bring himself to look at her corpse. The family gathers supplies while Nat shields his wife and children from the horrific sights of the victims. Once they return home and unload their supplies, Nat checks the cottage's perimeter, testing and reinforcing weak spots to make it a secure refuge. There are no signs of aircraft, no sign of help. Nat harbors little faith in the authorities, as if past disappointments have colored his view. No plan, no real organization. And we don't matter down here. That's what it is. We've got to wait and take what comes. Looking out to sea, he briefly deceives himself into thinking Navy ships are approaching, only to realize it's the gulls rising with the tide. Inside the cottage, he and his wife ponder the fate of other European countries, with Mrs. Hocken hoping the Americans will come to their aid. Nat devises more methods to protect the windows, listening as the birds stab the front door with their beaks, contemplating the knowledge and ancient memories these creatures have accumulated over the ages. He lights his last cigarette, one he had promised to save for a rainy day, and tosses the empty packet into the kitchen fire, watching as it burns. I hope you enjoyed this video. Leave a like if you did, and be sure to subscribe. Thank you.